It looks that way. Okay, I think I'm recording.
Okay.
Right, so
Your sound is not good. If you can speak better into your microphone, that would be a good thing.
Can you hear me better now?
A little better.
Okay, I've got my mic up all the way, as far as I know.
Okay.
All right. So first I'm going to talk about 3 different presentations I did through mostly Zoom. I'll talk a little bit about the content of those talks. The first one was entitled Maximizing a Journey to One's Roots. And I presented it at the JGS meetings in 2019. I also, I think, presented it to you all prior to the lockdown. And I believe I've given it at least one other place. And I'll talk a little bit about that. First, one of the key things that I emphasize is it's important to, when I traveled to Eastern Europe, I hired 3 different genealogical guides, Alex Denai, I'm blocking on the one in Poland, and then Julius Mueller in Czech Republic. They were invaluable, and I think that's critical to hire somebody who's knowledgeable about genealogy. So, excuse me, the phones. Hold on a second.
So of course, if you're going to get one phone call, it has to be in the middle of your own presentation.
Yeah, I didn't think about that in advance, sorry. The other thing to comment on in terms of the travels to my route, I did it partly for myself, but also for the town research groups that I have been working with. There's about 14 of them, and I'll describe that a little later, all the 14 different groups that I work with. And so I collected information on not only things relevant to my family, but like all the gravestones in the cemetery in Scala, as well as in the New York City area. And I also, because I'd gotten some information, took photos of all the houses where people Jewish had lived in prior to the Holocaust. So that's just a little bit of an overview of that talk. Second talk I gave, maximizing the work of Jewish Gen town research groups. I also gave to IAJGS in 2021, and I've given it to the Baltimore group, as well as Marianne Evans' Eastern European group that meets at the Family History Center. And some of the things that I feel important in working with town research groups, setting up an email system. Jewish Gen has Kahila links websites for each town. So that's certainly something to do. We try to meet periodically in person or via Zoom. We translated the Yiska book. We helped make sure that certain righteous Gentiles were added to the Yad Vashem. We developed contacts with people in the local town, the mayor and the school principal. And the school principal in Scala is a granddaughter of or grandniece of a righteous Gentile, and she's been very helpful to us in a number of ways. As I said, we collect data. We took pictures of all the cemetery stones in Scala, as well as the 3 cemeteries in New York. Took pictures of the homes. We're talking about exchanging family trees and DNA. Third talk that I've given is entitled Internment on the Isle of Man during World War II. And I gave that talk both to a group that we formed of people who have connections to internment or doing research on it, and then also to the Philadelphia chapter. And my parents escaped from Vienna after Hitler had marched in, met in London, got married. And in 1940, the Nazis started bombing England. And so they started interning like the Japanese. But I know 30,000 people were interned on the Isle of Man. I don't know total numbers, mostly from Germany, Austria, and Italy, and most of them Jewish, because they didn't know who to trust, unfortunately. And they were in separate camps, the men and the women. So my parents occasionally met and they corresponded weekly. And I've given the letters that my parents, my mother kept my father's letters, and I gave those letters to several museums. I kept the originals. And there's a lot of useful information that I shared in that talk about their experience, as well as we visited a number of the camps there in 2016, and I described that talk. Let's go to the next slide. So I've just published this past April a talk talking about the Landsmannschaften, which were the original groups formed starting in the late 19th century, 19th century, and where people from the Eastern European towns came and they formed groups to kind of support each other, both socially and financially. In the 1920s, they sent money back to Eastern Europe because the economy was very poor in Europe after World War I. And most of those, I think just about all of them have died somewhere after World War II. The Scala one died in 2001 in a sense. So that was one of the longest surviving ones. And so I've talked about the evolution from Landsmannschaften to the more modern concept of town research groups, or also known as Kahila groups, that Jewish term they use. So that was published in Devat in this past April. That's the JGS of New York website publication. The other article that I was involved in, entitled Tony Hausner's Genealogical Journey, which was published in the Washington Jewish Week and Baltimore Jewish Times, primarily discussed the work I've just described. The only other thing it mentioned, we believe, but we're not certain, that we were related to Gideon Hausner, who was the chief prosecutor of Adolf Eichmann in 1961, probably one of the most important trials, Holocaust trials. And so it talks some of.
Just muted yourself.
Don't know how I did that, but so the next slide.
Tony, could you move it on?
Okay, this just lists all the different town research groups that I have worked with in leadership different ways. The Scala Polskaya, where my mother was born, she moved to Vienna with her family when she was 1, but my grandmother lived there, and my great-grandfather raised his family there. He moved from Borshoff, and so here the 5 towns. Oh, I'm missing Toulouse. There's actually 6 towns that I'm involved with in Galicia. There's a whole bunch of towns in Czech Republic that my family on my father's side had lived in. My wife's family comes from Plock in Poland and another town, Wizardred. And then I formed just a couple of years ago an Isle of Man internment group. We actually cover all the internment camps in the British Commonwealth, the former British Commonwealth. Some of the camps were in England itself, Canada, Australia,
We're
etc.
gonna have to move on.
Am I over 10 minutes?
Yeah,
Okay, I'll just take one more second. Two other things I've been involved in. A wall was built around the Scala Cemetery, and it was shortly after falling apart, and I'm trying to figure out how to get that restored. And then in Vilna, the government is, in a sense, wants to put a massive building in the center of the cemetery and destroy lots of gravestones. I'm not leading that, but I'm providing some support on that. So that's it.
thank you, Tony. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, and here's Tony's contact information if people have any questions about what he's doing. Next is Nancy Kotz. Nancy,
Yeah, I just unmuted. Thank you, Mary Jane. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me?
yes.
Yes,
Okay, great. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach here, and we can go to my first slide. So we were, my father's side of the family was actually in the planning stages for a family reunion for actually both lines on my father's family. And I'll explain that reason in a moment. We were in the process of planning this reunion for the summer of 2020 in New England, in Springfield, Massachusetts, when the pandemic struck. And is the same line. We have the situation where there were the